Hi and welcome to another tutorial from Hans, and today we're looking at the FFmpeg color shift bug. Now, in my many years of using Blender, I've come across this color shift bug where the colors that I see in the preview in the compositor window of Blender is different from the final output video render that I see, right? And this is only for video, not for image sequences, and this is using the FFmpeg encoder. It doesn't really matter which codec I use in the encoder, be it V9, AV1, H.264, H.265, Fiora. In each instance, there is a difference in the color that I see in my preview window versus what I see in my final video output. So in this video today, we're going to take a look at what that problem is. We're going to look at why that problem is, and we're going to look at how to fix that problem. Cool. Let's get into it. Okay then, so for us to understand more about this FFmpeg bug, right, we need to understand more about color spaces and display devices and how different color spaces serve different purposes. So a good way to show this is actually in Blender itself, because Blender has some ways to change the color space viewing options according to these color spaces, right? So if I take off my face for a bit here and come down to the view, this is a project of mine, the outro of Tomahawk, and I'm in my render properties on my right. So we're focusing on the right side, and we've gone down to color management here. And in color management, we see display device and we see sRGB. Good. And if we click this drop down menu, we see a couple of options. We see display P3, we see rect 1886, and we see rect 2020. Cool. So the first thing you know about color spaces, right, because these are a list of color spaces, is that they have something to do with the display device. Good. And that's a good way to start this. The way we display content is primarily how different color spaces came about, and we have different means and different mediums for which we watch or we have content displayed to us. So the main display content for the digital web is sRGB. That is what Blender's default is. That is what the majority of monitor screens in the world display, and it is the current standard of display device technology. Now there's other color spaces that have risen up, and other color spaces that predate sRGB that serve different purposes or recognize the deficiencies or the lack of color representation in sRGB, and have sprung up for to increase the amount of color that's represented. So if we look at P3 is like the step up to sRGB today, right? And it's what most devices are heading to. I think all Apple devices use P3 currently. I think that's the case. And display P3, even though there's two types of display P3, but in a nutshell, it's a broader color spectrum, right? That's more representative of what our eye can see versus what our screens can display. Good. Rect is the one that's really principal responsible for this color shift. Now we're going to talk about what rect is. Now rect is a color space that was designed for video consumption on analog TVs or on TV screens and cinema. That's where rect comes in, and it is the industry standard for cinema to this day, right? So, but rect has, like sRGB and P3 has different types, and in the drop down list we saw rect 1886 and we saw rect 2020. Rect 2020 is the newest one that hasn't been implemented quite as well. Rect 1886 is actually a modification of Rect 709. So it's basically Rect 709 with a different power coefficient. And we have another one that we need to consider, which is Rect 601. So 601 was the first one, 709 is the second, 1886 is the third, and 2020 is the fourth. And all of them are aimed at improving the color representation of video, right? In accordance to how we consume it. So if we take a look at this right here, right now we're in the color space of sRGB because that's the default. Now if we change this default to P3, we can see that the color representation has changed. Now if you have a P3 screen that's calibrated to display P3 accurately, then you'll see the difference, a greater difference than for me right now, who's only calibrated for sRGB for one of my screens. But it looks noticeably duller, but the reality is that there's a small color representation there, and as such, what was perceived to be saturated in the sRGB space is not so saturated in the P3 space, because P3 has more color wideness. It can represent more colors. Good. And if we change over to Rect 1886, we notice that it looks very similar to the sRGB. Not quite as there, but very similar. And this is where the crux of the matter is. When we export in FFmpeg, so we're on to the Y. When we export to FFmpeg through Blender, we use FFmpeg's default settings. Now, FFmpeg's default settings is to use Rect 601. It has the capability to record in Rect 709, Rect 886, and even Rect 2020, but the default is 601. And currently in Blender does not have a way for us to determine what type of color space we want to use for the output render. It can do it for the display device, but it can't do it for the output render. So if we take a look at what happens when we don't have this in consideration, let's take a look at what it looks like when we export and we don't quite know the differences between display devices, right? We end up with color shifts. So on the left of this image, we can see that the plum is kind of dull and red and washed out. Good. Not representative of the full color. Also, there's a kind of green, a more tendency towards a green hue. In the right, this is how the colors were seen on the screen and how it's represented. This is the difference between Rect 601 on the left and Rect 709 on the right. And we can see that this is a world difference. For Tomahawk my show, it is particularly an egregious color shift, because the main color is this plum, this sorrel color, and it's significantly impacted by the difference between the two. Now, why is 709 so good for sRGB content? Because 709 was made with sRGB in mind. It was made so that the color conversion between the two showed as minimal difference between the colors as possible. 709 was made, Rect 709 was made to be compatible with sRGB screens, and that's why this is such a great format to use, right, with sRGB produced content. So if I export sRGB from Blender, good, and I export it in a way that I'm using the 709 Rect codec, then, or not Rect color space, sorry, then I can be assured that the colors are going to be the most true to life, right? Or the most true to the original thing that I see on my screen, right? And the best way to do that is to use like a rect 1806 because that's the closest to 709, or you can use sRGB, which is not too far off either. Good. So the best practice here is to set your display device, right, to the viewing of the color space that you're going to use. So if we can't use 609, if we can only use 609 in the render FFmpeg color space, how then do we get around this? Now for me, the best option that I use is to convert it after I export it, and you can do so in the CMD or the terminal. So if we go over to the terminal here, good. Let's go over actually to this first before I even go to the terminal. So this is the code that I put in the terminal. For you, it would be the CMD, or if you're using Windows, it'd be the command prompt. I don't know what they call it for Mac, but I'm sure Mac has a name for this as well. And in that prompt is where you would enter in this data. It's the same code for CMD as it is for the terminal in Linux. So I use Linux, right? So we're going to take a look at these inputs and see what they actually mean. So we have here FFmpeg, good. And the FFmpeg is the start keyword to tell the terminal or the command prompt what program we're using. We're using FFmpeg. Then out of the FFmpeg prompts, we have the .i, the dash I, which simply just means input. So what is your input file that's going to be worked upon? And in this case, I have outro.mp4, but that would be the name of your file, whatever it is that you're converting. Good. Then you have dash codec :v. So the codec, right, is the codec of the video, and the V suggests what type of codec is this for. Is this audio codec or is it a video codec? In this case, it's a video codec. That's the one we're converting. And then we're going to enter in the type of the library of that codec, right? And that's the library x264 for me. You could be using x265, you could be using AV1. You would have to get the appropriate names for whatever codec you're converting. However, in my case, it's lib x264. Good. Next is the VF or video format. Good. And the video format option under that we're looking at is the color matrix, and the color matrix is what's going to do the converting for us from the rect 601, as we see here, that's represented by BT601, to the rect 709, it was represented by the BT709. So that's BT601 :2 BT709. Good. That's the magic line. And then lastly, you're gonna have a space and have the name of the output file that you want the converted file to have. So that's the input, that's the codec, video codec, that's the video format color matrix change, and that's the name of the output. Now whatever it is that you are converting to for the color matrix, if this was rect 2020, then you would use 2020, right? If it was the I'm not sure about the 1886, but I'm pretty sure it's probably standard or close to it, right? So that's what you would put here, and it would look something to the effect of this. So if we go into the terminal now and have it entered, you'd have the change. Alright, so we go here, we see ffmpeg.ash, and this is where you would enter it. The only thing that you'd have to do now is just make sure that whatever file you're converting, you're in that file path. So my file path currently is my home file path. It has philip.philip, number one, right? And for CMD and also for Linux, you would make sure you're in your appropriate directory, and this will convert to the color space. And what I had showed you before is the result of this. This was the output of the video. that was 601 that comes out of Blender, and this is the output of the video on my right that is converted, and that's how you get the colors done. Now I know this is more of a talky type of video, but I think it's important for you to see. I'll also put the content in the bottom of the video so that you can see. I'll put the terminal commands there so you can have them to use. But if you see a color shift in your content, it's most likely because your display device in Blender is not matched up with the color space that you're using. Remember, if you're using FFmpeg, it does not, it uses Rect 609 first as the video converter as the default, and there's no way to change it, so you'll have to do an after change if you want the colors to be accurate. I don't think there's a way in Blender currently to do the change in Blender, so you have to keep this in mind when you're doing your output renders. I hope this was helpful, and I hope this helped. I hope if some persons would have saw difference, didn't know where to start or where to begin. But this is the way that I have found, and it's been effective. So until I see you again with another tutorial, get up and design a new dawn. Later.